In March 2009, the bodies of 35-year-old Clara Donovan and 37-year-old Daniel Harper were discovered buried beneath a concrete slab at a construction site in a quiet Oklahoma suburb. What began as a missing persons investigation quickly unraveled into a chilling story of betrayal and calculated revenge. The shocking details revealed the deadly fallout of an affair between Clara and Daniel, one that shattered the trust of 38-year-old contractor James Donovan, leading to a crime that left the community reeling. This is the story of how a seemingly picture-perfect life descended into darkness, forever altering the lives of those involved. On the 6th of March, 2009, Clara Donovan's sister sat in a dimly lit diner, staring at her untouched coffee. Clara hadn't shown up for their weekly lunch date, something she had never done without at least calling ahead. Clara was the type to honor commitments, even if she was running late. Worried, her sister dialed Clara's number several times, but it went straight to voicemail. Unease grew with each unanswered call. By early evening, her sister made the decision to contact the police. That same evening, in another part of the city, Daniel Harper's wife stood in their quiet living room, anxiously watching the clock. Daniel had told her he was running a quick errand with a friend earlier that afternoon. He hadn't been specific, but Daniel was known for being easygoing and reliable. Hours passed, and the daylight faded into night, but Daniel hadn't returned. His phone too went silent, calls going unanswered. When she called his office, hoping for answers, she was told he hadn't been there all day. Her unease turned to panic as she realized something was wrong. She called the authorities that night, describing her husband as a man who always kept his promises. As the 7th of March dawned, investigators began looking into the separate missing persons reports, initially unaware of the connection between Clara Donovan and Daniel Harper. Clara's family described her as a dedicated wife and teacher, a woman loved by her students and respected by her peers. Daniel's wife painted a picture of a charismatic and dependable man who balanced a busy career in real estate with a vibrant social life. To the outside world, these were two people with no reason to disappear. But when officers began tracing their last known movements, a link emerged. Both Clara and Daniel had been seen near a construction site managed by James Donovan on the afternoon of March 3rd. Witnesses mentioned seeing Clara's car parked nearby, and one worker recalled James speaking to Daniel earlier that day. This new lead turned the focus onto the construction site, an expansive housing project that James had been overseeing for months. By the 8th of March, a crew of investigators arrived at the site. The workers were cooperative, but it didn't take long for a foreman to bring up something unusual. A section of concrete had been poured late at night on March 4th, days earlier than the schedule required. Concrete pouring was a process carefully planned and executed to ensure stability, and any deviation from the schedule raised eyebrows. One worker mentioned seeing James at the site that night, working alone under the dim glow of portable lights. His explanation at the time had been simple. He wanted to get ahead of schedule. The investigators turned their attention to the area. The concrete patch was fresh, and the workers noted that James had insisted on keeping it off limits. When forensic experts arrived later that day, their ground-penetrating radar revealed something shocking: anomalies beneath the slab. The eerie silence that fell over the site was palpable as the team began to dig. What they unearthed was horrifying. Two bodies, one male and one female, lay encased in the concrete, positioned as if discarded without care. The smell of decay mixed with the sharp tang of wet cement hung heavy in the air. The bodies were soon identified as Clara Donovan and Daniel Harper, their features still faintly recognizable despite the damage caused by the weight of the concrete and the passage of time. Forensic examiners noted disturbing details. Clara bore bruises around her neck, suggesting strangulation, while Daniel's skull showed signs of blunt force trauma. Both deaths were violent, deliberate, and personal. The discovery turned the construction site into a crime scene swarmed with police tape, flashing lights, and horrified onlookers. Investigators quickly zeroed in on James Donovan. His connection to both victims was undeniable. Clara was his wife, and Daniel was his best friend. When questioned on March 8th, James appeared calm, his demeanor almost unnervingly composed. He claimed he hadn't seen either of them in days and feigned ignorance about their disappearance. However, investigators noted his vague answers and lack of concern, which did little to ease their suspicions. The forensic evidence began to pile up. Clara's wedding ring, still bearing traces of cement, was found near the edge of the slab, as if it had slipped off during the hurried burial. A receipt for concrete mix, dated March 4th, was traced back to James. GPS records from his truck placed him at the site late that night. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of a man meticulously covering up a gruesome act. By the 20th of March, investigators had gathered enough to arrest James Donovan. The local community, still reeling from the shocking discovery, was left to grapple with the horrifying truth. A respected contractor, a husband, and a best friend had turned into a calculated killer. The crime, so chilling in its precision and so personal in its motive, would haunt the town for years to come. James Donovan was the kind of man who believed in structure, routine, and hard work. His life revolved around precision, whether it was in his contracting business or his personal relationships. From the outside, his world looked perfect. He had built a solid career, earned the respect of his colleagues, and shared his life with Clara, the woman he had loved since high school. But what people didn't see were the small cracks that had been forming beneath the surface for years. James had married Clara in the spring of 1995, under the sprawling oak trees of their hometown park. It was a picture-perfect wedding, with Clara radiating joy and James exuding quiet pride. Over the years, they built a modest home together in the suburbs. Clara worked as an elementary school teacher, adored by her students and admired by parents. Her vibrant personality was a stark contrast to James's reserved nature, and in the early days of their marriage, their differences seemed to balance each other. But as the years passed, the demands of James's career began to take a toll on their relationship. His work as a contractor required long hours, often leaving him too exhausted to notice the growing distance between them. Clara, who had once thrived on his stability, began to feel like a shadow in her own home. Her days were filled with the laughter of children, but her evenings were marked by the silence of a husband buried in blueprints and deadlines. It was during this time of emotional drift that Daniel Harper entered the picture more prominently. Daniel had been James's best friend since their college days in the late 1980s. Where James was reserved and meticulous, Daniel was carefree and magnetic. As a successful real estate agent, Daniel had a natural charm that made him the life of any gathering. He often partnered with James on projects, bringing clients to the homes James built. Over time, his visits to the Donovan household became more frequent. At first, Clara saw Daniel as a link to her husband's world, a friendly presence who brought laughter into their home. They began talking more during casual dinners, or when James's work pulled him away. Their conversations were light at first, focused on shared interests or funny anecdotes about James. But as Clara's loneliness deepened, their connection grew. By the summer of 2008, their interactions began to blur the line between friendship and something more. Their relationship took a darker turn in the fall of that year. What started as harmless conversations evolved into stolen moments and late-night meetings. Clara sought comfort in Daniel's attention, a stark contrast to the emotional void she felt at home. For Daniel, it was the thrill of forbidden love, dangerous and intoxicating. They justified their actions to themselves, convinced that no one would get hurt as long as they kept their secret. But keeping secrets became harder as their affair deepened. Clara, once lively and warm, began to withdraw from her life with James. She avoided their usual routines and seemed distracted even during small conversations. James noticed the changes but didn't address them immediately. His methodical nature made him hesitant to jump to conclusions. Instead, he watched, his quiet observations masking the growing unease within him. In February 2009, James's suspicions were confirmed in the cruelest way. While organizing their closet one evening, he found a crumpled hotel receipt in the pocket of Clara's coat. The receipt, dated just days earlier, listed a room for two at a nearby hotel. James's stomach tightened as he stared at the damning evidence. He spent hours that night combing through Clara's belongings, hoping against hope that he was mistaken. Then he found her phone. Clara had carelessly left it charging on the nightstand, a message preview still lighting up the screen. When James opened it, he saw explicit texts exchanged with Daniel. The words were sharp and vivid, cutting deeper than any wound. The betrayal was undeniable, their affair laid bare in black and white. That night, James barely slept. He sat in the darkened living room, his mind replaying years of memories with Clara and Daniel. He thought about the trust he had placed in his best friend, the love he had poured into his marriage, and how both had been shattered. The man who had built homes with his bare hands now felt his own world crumbling beneath him. But James didn't react in anger, not outwardly. His mind, always analytical and composed, turned to cold calculation. Instead of confronting Clara or Daniel, he chose to observe them further. He became colder and more distant at home, a shadow of his former self. Clara noticed but misinterpreted his behavior, thinking it was another symptom of his workaholism. Daniel, on the other hand, remained oblivious, his arrogance blinding him to the quiet fury brewing in James. Over the following weeks, James began to piece together their movements and habits. He tracked Clara's unexplained absences, noting the patterns that aligned with Daniel's schedule. He revisited the construction site, reviewing every corner with a newfound purpose. His actions became meticulous, each step deliberate as he planned his response. By the end of February 2009, James had decided on a course of action. The man who once built homes with care and precision now prepared to destroy the two people who had torn his life apart. On the night of March 3rd, 2009, James Donovan stood under the dim floodlights at the construction site, staring at the skeletal frame of what would soon become a family home. The cool night air carried a stillness that matched the silence in his heart. He had planned this moment with meticulous precision, each step of the evening laid out like one of his blueprints, but no amount of planning could fully prepare him for what was about to unfold. Earlier that day, James had reached out to Daniel Harper, casually asking for help with an early pour of concrete at the new project. Daniel, unsuspecting as always, agreed without hesitation. To Daniel, it was just another favor for his best friend, another chance to share a laugh or trade stories. For James, it was a moment of reckoning, a chance to confront the man who had betrayed him in the most personal way. Clara was invited under a different pretense. James had asked her to bring him some food to the site, framing it as a thoughtful gesture to make his late-night work easier. Clara, oblivious to her husband's true intentions, had agreed. She thought it was a small way to reconnect, a chance to remind James of the woman he had married all those years ago. But she couldn't have known she was walking into a trap, one from which she would never return. Daniel arrived at the site first, parking his car under the shadow of an unfinished structure. The tools of James's trade, bags of cement, steel rods, and buckets, were scattered around the site, giving it the appearance of another ordinary work night. Daniel greeted James with his usual easygoing charm, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath his friend's calm exterior. Clara arrived shortly after, the headlights of her car cutting through the darkness. She stepped out carrying a bag of takeout, the aroma of food briefly masking the tension that had begun to fill the air. James watched her approach, his expression unreadable. To her, he looked tired but focused, as he often did during long projects. To James, every step she took toward him felt like another nail in the coffin of the life they had once shared. As the three of them stood together under the harsh glare of the construction lights, the atmosphere grew heavier. James's silence was no longer that of a man focused on his work. It was the silence of a predator stalking its prey. Finally, he broke the stillness, addressing them both with a voice so calm it was chilling. He didn't raise his voice or lash out. Instead, his words were measured, deliberate, and laced with an undertone of menace. The accusations came next, sharp and undeniable. Clara and Daniel froze, their shared guilt suddenly laid bare. Clara's face turned pale, her hands trembling as she realized the extent of what James knew. Daniel, always quick to recover, tried to deflect, his usual charm now coming off as hollow and desperate. But James was unmoved. His calm demeanor only made the tension more unbearable, like the silence before a thunderstorm. As the confrontation escalated, James reached for a crowbar lying nearby. The movement was quick, almost instinctive, and before Daniel could react, the first blow landed. The sound of metal striking bone echoed across the empty site, a sickening reminder of James's intent. Daniel collapsed to the ground, his body crumpling under the weight of the attack. Clara screamed, her voice piercing the night. But James's fury was unstoppable. He turned to her, his eyes devoid of the warmth they once held. Clara pleaded, her words choked with tears, but James was beyond reason. In that moment, the years of betrayal, the nights spent doubting himself, and the rage that had been simmering within him boiled over. He wrapped his hands around her neck, the act deliberate and final. The struggle was brief, and soon the site fell silent once more. The only sound, the distant rustling of the wind. James didn't allow himself time to dwell on what he had done. He moved with the precision of a man completing a task, his contractor's instincts taking over. He dragged their lifeless bodies to the edge of the freshly dug foundation. The concrete mixer roared to life, its mechanical hum filling the air as James worked quickly to pour the mixture over their remains. The wet cement splashed and settled, its gray surface slowly hardening into a cold, unyielding tomb. By the time James finished, the site looked as ordinary as it had hours earlier. He cleaned his tools, wiped away any traces of the night's events, and drove home, his mind disturbingly clear. To anyone who might ask, this had been just another long night at work. But beneath the surface of that freshly poured concrete lay the evidence of his calculated revenge. In the days that followed, James played the role of the grieving husband with unnerving ease. On the 6th of March, he reported Clara missing, his voice filled with carefully rehearsed concern. He joined search efforts, spoke to neighbors, and answered every question from the police with measured composure. He even attended a vigil organized by Clara's sister, standing among the crowd, as if he too was searching for answers. But cracks in his story began to emerge. Investigators found inconsistencies in his timeline, subtle but significant enough to raise suspicion. Workers at the construction site mentioned the unusually early concrete pour and James's insistence on working alone that night. Forensics uncovered Clara's wedding ring, which had slipped off and been partially embedded in the concrete. Security footage from a nearby hardware store showed James purchasing additional materials late at night on March 4th, further incriminating him. By the 20th of March, the evidence was overwhelming. Police arrived at James's home early that morning, their voices firm but calm, as they placed him under arrest. The once respected contractor, known for his meticulous work and quiet demeanor, was now the prime suspect in a crime that had shocked the community. As the patrol car pulled away, neighbors stood in stunned silence, struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster he had become. The trial of James Donovan began in September 2010, a full 18 months after his arrest, but the public's fascination with the case had not waned. Every detail of the murders, the betrayal, and the calculated execution of James's revenge had been dissected in newspapers, talk shows, and community gatherings. In the small Oklahoma town where it all took place, James had gone from being a respected contractor to a figure of grim notoriety. The courtroom was packed from the very first day, with reporters and onlookers vying for a glimpse of the man whose story had captivated and horrified them. The prosecution wasted no time painting James as a man consumed by a cold, simmering rage. They described his actions not as a momentary lapse in judgment, but as a meticulously planned execution. The prosecutor, a sharp and seasoned attorney named Karen Michaels, presented James as someone who had been betrayed but chose vengeance over any legal or moral recourse. She detailed how James lured Daniel Harper and Clara Donovan to the construction site on March 3, 2009, under false pretenses, and how he executed his plan with chilling precision. Evidence spoke louder than any argument. Photos of the construction site, the timeline of the cement pour, and forensic details left little doubt about the brutality of the crime. The wedding ring, partially embedded in the concrete, became a symbol of both the betrayal and the gruesome lengths to which James had gone to erase his wife and best friend from his life. Security footage of James purchasing materials late at night on March 4th and testimonies from workers at the site were used to emphasize his calculated behavior. Karen Michaels also highlighted the personal nature of the killings. She described how James had struck Daniel with a crowbar and how his violent anger had turned on Clara, ending her life with his bare hands. This wasn't a crime of convenience, she argued. It was an act of control and retribution. Every detail painted James as a man who had planned his revenge down to the last detail, ensuring that their bodies were hidden beneath the very concrete that symbolized his work and precision. The defense, led by attorney Mark Reeves, took a vastly different approach. They argued that James's actions were the result of temporary insanity, a response to the emotional devastation he suffered upon discovering the affair between his wife and his best friend. Reeves described James as a man who had been pushed to his breaking point, a man who had given everything to the people closest to him, only to be betrayed in the most intimate way possible. The defense team emphasized James's reputation as a hard-working, honest individual, who had never before shown signs of violence or instability. Psychologists were brought in to testify about the mental toll of betrayal and how it could drive even the most rational individuals to irrational behavior. They described how James's stoic nature likely suppressed his emotions until they erupted in an uncontrollable act of violence. Reeves portrayed James not as a monster, but as a broken man, undone by the people he trusted most. Throughout the trial, James sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Some days, he appeared to be listening intently, his eyes following each piece of evidence presented against him. On other days, he seemed distant, as if he were somewhere else entirely. His demeanor gave little away, leaving the public to speculate about what he truly felt. Was he remorseful, or was he simply resigned to his fate? The emotional toll on the families involved was impossible to ignore. Clara's sister, who had been the first to report her missing on March 6, 2009, attended every day of the trial, clutching a photograph of Clara. Her tears were a constant reminder of the loss suffered by those left behind. Daniel's wife, who had trusted James as a family friend, sat quietly, her face pale and strained. She avoided looking at James, as if the sight of him was too much to bear. Meanwhile, James's family, including his elderly parents, sat in the back of the courtroom, grappling with the weight of the son they thought they knew, and the man the evidence revealed. The trial lasted 4 weeks, each day more grueling than the last. The media reported every detail, from the testimonies of witnesses to the body language of those in the courtroom. Speculation ran rampant. Would the jury see James as a victim of emotional torment or as a calculating murderer? Public opinion was divided, with some sympathizing with his pain and others condemning his actions as unforgivable. When the jury retired to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. For 2 days, they reviewed the evidence, weighed the arguments, and debated James's state of mind. Finally, on a crisp September morning in 2010, they returned with their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman rose to deliver the decision. James Donovan was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The words hung heavy in the air, eliciting a gasp from the audience. Clara's sister broke down in tears, clutching her photograph tightly, while Daniel's wife stared straight ahead, her expression a mix of relief and sorrow. James remained still, his face unreadable, as the reality of his fate set in. The sentencing hearing took place a few weeks later. On October 15, 2010, James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were clear. While his betrayal had been profound, it did not excuse the calculated brutality of his actions. For James, the courtroom marked the end of his freedom and the beginning of a life spent behind bars. For the families of Clara and Daniel, the verdict brought some measure of closure, but the scars left by their loss would never fully heal. They were left to rebuild their lives in the shadow of a tragedy that had forever changed them, while James began his own reckoning in the cold, unyielding walls of a prison cell. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss our daily updates, including the insane case of the dead wife discovered in the morning in back garden hot tub after crazy party with other couple. Be sure to check it out and share your thoughts in the comments.